Russia has expressed full support for Venezuela's socialist president Nicolas Maduro. It comes ahead of an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council at the request of Venezuela. US President Donald Trump has been ramping up pressure on Maduro, saying it would be smart for him to step down. The United States blockade of oil tankers is fueling anger.
Crowds have gathered in the streets of Caracas as Venezuelans show defiance against the U.S. military buildup and naval blockade of the country's coast. Venezuela is accusing the U.S. of piracy after its maritime blockade and seizure of oil tankers in the Caribbean Sea.
We condemn those who steal oil from Venezuelans because it is ours.
We are here today to tell the world that we are here to defend our homeland in any circumstance and at any time that may arise.
Venezuela's President Maduro suggested that Donald Trump should focus on the U.S.'s own problems.
I have been reflecting in recent days on the illegal aggressions that have occurred. I think that President Trump could do better in his country and in the world. He would do better within his country on economic and social issues. He would do better if he attended to the issues of his country. Because it cannot be that 70% of his speeches, declarations, and time are about Venezuela.
Trump, for his part, warned Venezuela's president.
We have a massive armada formed, the biggest we've ever had, and by far the biggest we've ever had in South America. He can do whatever he wants, it's all right. Whatever he wants to do. If he wants to do something, if he plays tough, it'll be the last time he's ever able to play tough.
U.S. is increasing its pressure on Venezuela. Military aircrafts were seen operating in recent days at a naval station in Puerto Rico. And a seized oil tanker was seen off the coast of Texas. As a response, the Venezuelan Assembly introduced a so-called anti-piracy bill. Officials in Caracas restated their commitment to peace, unless the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and resources are jeopardized.
Joining us now from Oslo is Cecilie Expert. She's an expert on international law at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. On what legal grounds can a state seize a foreign oil tanker in international waters?
Well, there are several legal grounds that could be used. Now, the Trump administration has been resorting to a somewhat unusual approach by which they were in September declaring self-defense against narco-terrorists, and then in October declaring a non-international armed conflict between the U.S. and entities that they called narco-terrorists. And in November, they basically placed a group on this list led by Maduro, according to the Americans. So the Americans are basically claiming a type of war legal basis under the laws of armed conflict. And this is something that is provoking a lot of other states because they're very worried about the precedents that the United States may put on this. Now, the situation really escalated on the 16th of December when the Americans announced a naval blockade. Now, a naval blockade may be a measure that states resort to when there is an armed conflict, or under international law, such a naval blockade may be also interpreted as a declaration of war. So the Americans are really swimming in a rather dangerous waters when it comes to the type of legal argumentation that they are resorting to.
Because this is not a military campaign, according to the US. The Trump administration says the crackdown on US sanctioned tankers is legal. How do you see that?
No, the U.S. administration are currently involved in what you could call a very inventive acrobatics of international law. They're relying partly on immigration legislation, partly on counter-drug legislation, and partly on counter-terrorism legislation. And they have taken this up into international waters under something that the Trump administration claims is the unwilling and unable doctrine under international law. Now, the U.S. is basically suggesting that these attacks against boats has to do with the fact that the countries from which these boats come are unwilling and unable to do something about it, and therefore this is basically giving the U.S. Self-defense. Now, when it comes to the tankers, the situation is somewhat different, because this is part of an international sanction regime that the U.S. has been pushing against Venezuela for a long time, and now these two kind of different questions concerning narco traffic and narco terrorists, as the U.S. administration is calling them, and the sanctions against Venezuelan petroleum tankers, or the shadow fleet, is kind of becoming one single conflict. And that is quite dangerous, because at that moment it might escalate into a situation between the U.S. and the Venezuelan state. And that would then be an armed conflict.
So what do you see coming next? What do you expect from the UN Security Council, for example?
Now, the Venezuelans have called for this meeting, and they have gotten the Russians and the Chinese on board. And I think that for the Chinese, I mean, the petroleum that is now being blocked outside of the coast of Venezuela, this is oil going to China. So China has a vested interest in this issue. Now, the Russians, they have also been conducting increasingly over the past couple of 5-6 years, maritime exercises together with South American countries. And there seems to be this increased attempt by the U.S. administration, also in light of this new Trump Monroe corollary doctrine, trying to get other nations out of Latin America, and basically to state for everyone that this is the backyard of the U.S. Now, that, of course, is something that a lot of countries, not merely in Latin America, but around the world, is really, really concerned about. So I do believe that the meeting tonight and the next weeks is going really to be a question about to what extent other states in Latin America and around the world will mobilize against that push by the American administration.
And we will be following those developments closely. Cecilie Expert in Oslo, thank you very much for your time.
I'm joined in the studio now by DW's Oscar Schlenker, who was our correspondent in Venezuela for many, many years. Oscar, how do you see these latest threats against Maduro from Trump?
Well, I think they're on brand of what Trump has done in the past in terms of threatening Maduro. Coy in some issues, blunt in others. But the message is clear. He wants Maduro to step down, or he'll increase pressure. What we have seen is that they are stepping a bit back from land attacks, which was the threat, the former threat that we were listening to. And now they're increasing pressure on this maritime blockade of tankers.
And that increasing of pressure, is that successful?
I think so. I think it's much better than blowing up these alleged drug vessels and killing people, because that has brought a lot of criticism to Trump's administration. And this has prompted a lot more response internationally and from the Venezuelan government as well.
Now, Venezuela's government has accused the U.S. of piracy, stealing its oil. We got an impression of how average Venezuelans right now see all this tension developing quite calmly, actually. But is that representative of the whole population? How do average Venezuelans view this situation?
Yeah, I think the message that I'm getting from back home is that people are going about their day as they can, of course, surviving the increasing financial crisis that's looming, we could go into hyperinflation again. We just survived it a couple of years ago. After 4 years of hyperinflation, we might go step back into it next year if this pressure continues from the oil sector that's not being able to import or export oil.
Now, the UN Security Council will meet later today at the request of Venezuela to discuss the situation. Do you think that will have any impact?
I don't think it will have that much impact, but it will be interesting to hear the narratives of the different countries that are either supporting or against Venezuela. They're accusing the U.S. of piracy. It's a way of flipping the narrative as well, because these vessels, these tankers, are operating under dark fleet, or they call it a phantom fleet. They're operating under different flags that are not from Venezuela. And in terms of the International Maritime Organization, those ships are stateless if they're operating under different flags. Even the first tanker that was seized, the skipper, was operating under a Guyana flag. And it's very cynical because Venezuela has a territorial dispute with Guyana, and Guyana was the first one to protest that this tanker was operating under their flag. The second one was not sanctioned by the U.S., but was operating under a Panama flag, and Panama also protested. So it's a way of flipping the legitimacy of taking these tankers in regards to Venezuela, and we'll see how Russia and China are supporting Venezuela, because up to now, what we've seen is information coming from the Venezuelan government of the support of Russia and China. And I think Russia and China are doing the bare minimum in terms of diplomacy to support Venezuela. But we'll just have to see.
Why only that? I mean, they're traditionally supporters of the Maduro regime.
I think there's interests in Venezuela, and that's why they're still supporting it. But at the same time, they have had conversations with Donald Trump. We've seen Xi Jinping have a very good relationship with Donald Trump last time they met. Obviously, Russia has its own problems with Ukraine and all that development. So I think they don't want to stick their hands into another conflict, and especially one so far away, which is Venezuela.
Thank you very much. Oscar Schlenker here. Thank you.
Roxanna Vigil is a security analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. She specializes in U.S. foreign policy on Latin America. What is the Trump administration's ultimate goal or goals here in your eyes?
Sure. So we have about 4 months where the Trump administration provided a justification for the boat strikes and the naval deployment that was focused on a counter-narcotics mission, which did not really add up to all the rhetoric and the pressure against Maduro. Now the Trump administration has shifted just in the last 2 weeks to a justification that is focused on oil, land, and other assets that President Trump has alleged that Venezuela has stolen. That shift, to me, signifies a more forthcoming Venezuela-specific policy. They still haven't outright said Maduro must go, but that is clearly seems to be part of the policy objective for the Trump administration.
Okay, and one of its strategies is this blockade. Is that actually hurting the Venezuelan economy?
The blockade is going to absolutely hurt the Venezuelan economy. Venezuela's economy is almost completely dependent on its oil exports. And its oil exports have, for the last decade or more, been on a steep decline. And the U.S. sanctions that were imposed about 6 years ago further declined Venezuela's oil sector. Right now, Venezuela is exporting just under 1 million barrels per day, which is about 1% of global oil supply. It's a small amount in the global scale, but for Venezuela, it is their lifeline. Depending on how long this blockade lasts and depending on the scope of the blockade, is it only sanctioned vessels or also non-sanctioned vessels, you could see Venezuela's economy hurt a lot.
So can it do anything about the blockade? Can it prevent its tankers from being seized?
This is where I'm very worried. I think a war with Venezuela would be a big mistake, and the blockade does put the US military up against the Venezuelan military in a situation where you could see a confrontation at sea that is sort of the start of some direct kinetic conflict with Venezuela. So there is that risk, absolutely.
And ahead of this UN Security Council meeting, Russia has condemned Trump and pledged full support for Venezuela. What's at stake for the Kremlin here?
So far we've seen Russia provide rhetoric in support, diplomatic support. We haven't seen much beyond that. What's at stake for Russia with regard to Venezuela is that Venezuela owes Russia quite a bit based on prior loans from years ago, and Venezuela has not been able to pay. So Russia is a significant creditor for Venezuela. And of course, there is the diplomatic, security, intelligence cooperation that's grown over the last several years. So a lot of that is at stake, but I wouldn't expect to see Russia putting anything beyond that rhetorical support and diplomatic support for Venezuela.
And what do you think Venezuela is going to get out of this emergency meeting?
I believe Venezuela is going to be looking for some stronger international condemnation against the U.S. military deployment and the blockade that's been announced. However, where I see the real role of the international community and where they can add value to bringing the temperature down on the escalation between the United States and Venezuela is through trying to mediate some sort of negotiated solution. To me, that's really the only way out of this. The alternative is a war, which I don't think is desirable for anyone. And even in that situation, you would still eventually need a negotiated solution. So I do see the UN or other key countries that have been involved in past negotiations playing a role here to bring the United States and Venezuela to the table to negotiate a solution.
You heard it from Roxanna Vigil, Counsel on Foreign Relations. Thank you.